yesterday, and but yeah, I hope everybody had a nice time. I know that there's some that are battling some illnesses. Sounds like Melissa's sick and Judy's fighting something too. So just kind of stuff going around, and just keep people in your prayers. It's that time of year again, isn't it? When everybody catches everything. So what are you pointing at? What? Oh. Okay. All right. It wasn't because you guys are fighting or anything. Okay, that's good.
And Judy wasn't fighting, she's just going to lay in there.
She's just giving up. That's funny. What about Melissa? Is she fighting?
She's surviving.
She's surviving. Okay, all right. Well, anyways, keep them in your prayers. Go ahead and open up your Bibles to Revelation chapter 2, and that's where we will pick up. We're going to look at the church in Smyrna and also briefly at the church in Philadelphia as we kind of go through this study. And I believe David talked about the church in Ephesus last week. That's the first of the 7 churches of Asia. And so we'll kind of be spending the remainder of the quarter looking at these various churches mentioned from Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3. And so with that being said, let's go ahead and just start with a quick word of prayer. Father in heaven, we're grateful to come back here and to open up your word and to learn more about you. And we're grateful for the time off that we've had, and as various people got to enjoy time with family and friends and loved ones. And we're just so grateful for that, God, and a reminder of these great gifts that you've blessed us with. And we just ask that you help us to direct our minds at this time towards spiritual things and to hopefully give us some encouragement as we head out into the rest of the week. And we thank you most of all for your son, Jesus. It's in his name we pray. Amen. All right, so as I said, we're going to be talking about the church in Smyrna just briefly. And Ray said you're going to have to make a lot of stuff up about Smyrna because, we don't read in Acts about this church being established or anything like that. Most likely, a lot of these churches that are talked about were probably, if you recall, we talked about Epaphras was probably the guy that got the gospel from Paul while he spent a couple years in Ephesus, and was just the way he's talked about in the letter to Colossians and those epistles. It seems like Epaphras was probably responsible, played a vital role in establishing, Colossae, the church in Laodicea, and a lot of people surmise that he was responsible for perhaps establishing some of these other churches. Of course, the origin isn't always the most important thing, but as you look at these letters, it's always talked about, why only 7 churches that are mentioned in this section of Revelation 2 and 3. And of course, you find that 7 is a really symbolic number. It's a nice round biblical number symbolizing completeness or perfection. And so certainly you see that number 7 popping up over and over in the book of Revelation. And so a lot of people look at these churches as representing, the various types of churches that existed at that time. And that's certainly plausible. What a lot of people assume is that these were kind of, these were kind of the main cities, the main hubs. And so whatever letter is going to end up in Ephesus, that letter is probably going to be circulated to whatever smaller communities, smaller churches existed in the immediate area. And as you go through and you look at Smyrna and Pergamum, and that's probably the case there as well. So it's not like this letter, Revelation, as we're reading it now today, it's not like, it's probably very unlikely that this letter only ended up in the hands of those churches. This was a letter that was probably broadly circulated beyond just these 7 churches of Asia. And as you get down to the end of everything that Jesus says to each of these churches, he's always saying, he who has an ear, let him hear, right? And so these lessons were not just to be limited to the particular church that he's addressing, but were something that everybody who reads them is supposed to heed if they apply. And so this was probably, a likely path that somebody would have taken in delivering these letters. Where that line starts in the bottom left, that's Patmos. That would have been where John received this revelation as he's kind of exiled and going through the various persecution that he was suffering at that time. It's kind of interesting. Some commentators bring out, and you can kind of imagine it, seeing it on the map, how close that little island was to Asia Minor. He could probably see on a clear day the region of Asia Minor. And you can imagine him probably being the last apostle at this time, or certainly one of the last apostles at this time, as most of them at this point have been killed or imprisoned, as he is imprisoned. You can imagine him having a great amount of influence, but also longing for these congregations and wanting to encourage them, wanting to build them up, wanting to help them in whatever way that he can. And he receives this vision from God and is instructed to write these letters, these warnings. Some of them are encouragements, and to address them to these 7 churches of Asia. It kind of reminds me a little bit, if you've ever been to Alcatraz. One of the most haunting things that I learned from that is Alcatraz is just off of the main area of San Francisco, the boardwalk there, where all this liveliness and all of these various restaurants and city life, it all exists right there. And then off to the coast, in the middle of this little sound area, is Alcatraz. And they said that every night as the prisoners were going to sleep, if they were positioned towards the boardwalk there in San Francisco, they could see all the city lights, but then they could also hear all of these people enjoying their freedom, having a good time, and you're just a prisoner there having to watch all this unfold. I kind of thought of that a little bit as you look at Patmos and how it's positioned towards Asia Minor and all these people that John probably had in his heart as he's most likely anxious for these churches that existed in Asia Minor, and likely that and these churches that he likely was heavily involved with. But this was, again, a path that maybe somebody would have taken in delivering all these copies of the book of Revelation throughout these 7 churches of Asia Minor. And I wanted to look at the church of Smyrna and Philadelphia together, because what do those 2 churches have in common in this list of the 7 churches of Asia? What do you guys recall from that? What do they have in common? How many negative things are said about Smyrna, and how many negative things are said about Philadelphia? Maybe that should help. Yeah, they're the only 2 churches that John addresses here, that Jesus is really addressing, that Jesus has absolutely nothing negative to say about them. It's just simply keep enduring, keep doing what you're doing, keep holding on and being faithful to my name. And really, as you look at all these churches, there seems to be a pattern, and the middle 3 churches seems like it's kind of one section almost. And then the church in Smyrna and the church in Philadelphia seem to kind of mirror each other in a way, and it seems like they had some similarities. And so that's kind of why we're looking at these churches. Smyrna, of course, is the second one in the order, but Philadelphia, we're looking at that one kind of out of order, but simply because the things that Jesus says about Smyrna, you could likely also say about Philadelphia. They were these 2 shining examples of what a church should be. When you look at the other churches, they all had issues to varying degrees. There is 2 churches that Jesus has nothing positive to say. So they're the reverse of Smyrna and Philadelphia, and that's Sardis and Laodicea, where he really has nothing positive to say about them, only negative things. And so Smyrna and Philadelphia are, again, this shining example of what a church should be, where during a time where not all churches were doing what they were doing. It was relatively rare. And so maybe there's a valuable lesson in kind of asking the question, why is it that they were faithful out of all these different churches? A little bit of background. I mentioned I'm not going to have as much about Philadelphia. There just isn't as much available, or at least that I could find. But I was surprised to find there's a decent amount of information about Smyrna as far as just background and archaeological finds. And one of the things that stands out about Smyrna is that they have this long history of being exceptionally loyal to Rome. And now that's something that we've kind of talked about. We've looked at different regions as we've gone through these churches and looked at the various epistles. Philippians is one that comes to mind. And we've seen other regions that pledge this allegiance to Rome in a very special way. But Smyrna probably exceeds all of that, and just how early they were dedicated to Rome and how much they really prided themselves in their dedication, not just to Rome, but to the Roman emperor, and recognizing the Roman emperor as deity. And so this starts all the way back in 195 BC. So this is going 250 years or so, close to 300 years before this letter reaches Smyrna. But you can see this long history of loyalty to Rome. And this is during a time in history where the Seleucids were a very powerful nation. And they were moving in on Asia Minor, wanting to expand their territory. And this was probably the strongest they'd ever been. And for those of you that don't know, the Seleucids are kind of what emerges in the aftermath when Alexander the Great finally dies. And it was one of his generals that reigns over this nation known as the Seleucids. And as they're trying to expand, and as they're, this very strong military presence, obviously Smyrna is one of those cities that would have been threatened by this. And this was a time in history where Rome's, the amount of power that they would eventually enjoy was by no means obvious. It was still up in the air. Who's going to win between the Seleucids and this nation of Rome? And it was during that kind of uncertain era where nobody knew who was going to win that Smyrna, the small little port city, they pledge and kind of vocalize very loudly that they are going to be loyal to Rome. And so the way that they do this, again, is in 195 BC. You notice on my slide it says that they built a temple to honor Roma, a deified personification of the city of Rome. And so they're acknowledging Rome as kind of this deified nation, right? This God in and of itself. And when we get to the first century, that's obviously something that isn't all that uncommon, but they were doing this before it was cool, so to speak. And so just kind of the groundwork that's being laid for this city is this long history of a unique loyalty to Rome. And so a historian named Cicero, he remembers them for this and documents this. And he was a Roman citizen, a philosopher, a Roman writer, and I believe he wrote around the 2nd century. Pretty sure you can look that up on Google. But this is a quote that he has about them. He describes them as being among our most faithful and ancient allies. So not only were they their most faithful, but they had this long history of being extremely faithful to Rome. Another Roman historian, he remembers them for he describes them as having this extraordinary loyalty. So you see other people being loyal to Rome throughout history, but they kind of stood out from among the rest. And maybe one of the details that highlights this the most is there was this award that was given out by the Roman government where they would give somebody, or really they wouldn't give it to an individual, they would give it to an entire city. They would award them the title of, I'm going to mess this up, but Neokoros, which means temple warden. And basically what that means, and the reason why they would reward or award this to certain cities, was when they would prove an exceptional level of allegiance to the emperor as a god, right? And so Smyrna, they set up temples to worship whoever was reigning as emperor at the time. And so they were awarded this title 3 different times throughout their history. So there's 3 different times throughout the history of Smyrna where the Roman government is saying, wow, you guys are really special in the way that you acknowledge Caesar as a god, basically, is what's going on here. And for reference, the city that was awarded that title the most was Ephesus, and they received that title 4 times, right? So they received it 3 times. And the first time that they received this award was in 26 AD. So this is just a few years before Jesus is getting really active in his ministry. Then they were awarded it again early in the 2nd century, and then I believe the 3rd time was towards the end of the 2nd century AD. And so you can see that Smyrna, by the time we get to the Christian age, and by the time we're reading this letter, which was probably written towards the end of the 1st century, there's a lot of debate about that, but my view is that it was written towards the end of the 1st century. These Christians are kind of sandwiched between these eras where Smyrna has this fierce loyalty to Caesar as a god, to Caesar as Lord. The Christians would have said, Christos Kyrios. That means that Christ is Lord. Christ is King. the people in Smyrna, the average citizen, would have said, who is Lord? Caesar, right? Caesar is Lord. And to say anybody else is Lord is to spit in the face of Caesar, right? And so with all that being said, the obvious question would be, how would Smyrna's unique level of loyalty to Rome and its emperor make being a Christian more difficult in Smyrna? The city that prides itself in its worship of the Roman emperor as a god, how would that make being a Christian in Smyrna more difficult? Yeah, challenge to Rome, yep. And if you begin challenging Rome, how is that going to affect your life practically? So what would be the practical consequences if you decide one day to commit your life to Christ? How would somebody's life change living in Smyrna, do you suppose? In what ways? Being more difficult, obviously, but in what ways would it be more difficult? Targets? Yep. Yeah, you'd be targets. Yep. Let's look at when we read about Smyrna in this letter that Jesus tells John to write, you might get an insight into how this changed their life. And that's in Revelation chapter 2. Starting in verse 8, he says, "To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last who died and came to life. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death." So what are some things that stand out to you there that highlight the difficulties that Smyrna was experiencing and was about to experience? Poverty. So why were they suffering poverty, do you think? As I was kind of contemplating this, this doesn't quite compare, but maybe a close parallel to this for us today that we could relate to is my sister-in-law. She is a descendant and from a long line. In fact, she actually could trace her, this isn't saying much, but she could trace her lineage to Brigham Young. Brigham Young had a lot of wives, a lot of kids. But if she wanted to get a full ride scholarship to BYU, she could have done that because of who she descended from. And so she has family members that were Mormon. A lot of them aren't anymore. But I've gone back there to Utah with her and have had some conversations with people that have come out of Mormonism. And it's just very interesting if you talk about a city like Salt Lake, which has this extremely dense population, the highest density of Mormons in the United States, or in the world, actually, right? One thing that they talk about is, like, if you're going to start a local business and you're not a Mormon, that's going to affect the amount of business that you do. You're not going to do as much business as the guy down the street that is Mormon, because that's who they're going to favor. And if you're not in line with their beliefs, they're going to go a different direction, which is kind of something we do naturally anyways. But they talked a lot about how, again, if you're not of the same faith as what is prominent in the area, you suffer financially because of that. And you can imagine the cost that you'd be paying if you are a business owner, if you're trying to do trade, all the business that you are missing out on by rejecting Caesar as Lord and now saying that Jesus Christ is Lord, and the city that prides itself on worshiping Caesar as Lord. In Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 34, if you look at this, this kind of gives a little bit of insight. I'm going the wrong way. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 34 talks about how, let's just back up to verse 32. He says, "Recall the former days when you were enlightened. You endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one." Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. One of the ways that they would punish Christians was confiscating their property. And they would suffer financially because of this newfound faith in God. And so that's one thing that Jesus notes here, is that I know your tribulation and your poverty. In other words, the situation here isn't just that, the poor people are the ones that responded to the gospel. Very likely what's going on is that the reason that they have and are suffering from this poverty is because they are Christians, and they are suffering the fallout financially for that decision. So then you can just see other ways, that just obviously physical persecution and suffering that they would have to and be forced to endure. And you see that despite all that, they remain faithful. Again, Jesus says, I know your tribulation, your poverty, but you are rich. And the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested for 10 days. You will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. So from that text right there, who was it that they were, suffering persecution? Like, who was the instigators of this persecution that they were suffering? So Jews are involved in it, right? And what's the indication of that?
They say they're Jews, but they're really not. I think when he says they're not the spiritual Jews.
Okay.
They're the old physical, racial Jews.
Right, yeah. So, why would he say that they're not really Jews? Because, going along with what you're saying here.
That line, these people are God's people.
Uh-huh.
They are circumcised not in the flesh, right, but in the heart. They are following God spiritually. So he's making a contrast between the physical Jews who are now persecuting these people who are now God's chosen people.
Yep. Sometimes
Called Jews in a spiritual sense.
So why are they now called God's chosen people? Meaning that Jesus is Messiah, right? I mean, that's what's disqualifying them from being God's. I think you're right, Steve, that that's what's being communicated here, is that they're not really Jews because they've rejected the Messiah. And yet, probably what was going on at this time is the Christians, they enjoyed, for a little bit of time, they fell under the umbrella of Judaism, right? They were known as being an offshoot of Judaism, a sect within Judaism, and eventually all that changes, right? Where now the Jews are saying, no, they have nothing to do with us. And the reason why that's important is because the Jews, they were the one exception that was allowed to be a monotheistic society, right? They were the one community that Rome looked at and said, okay, you can worship your God and you don't need to, acknowledge our Caesar as God necessarily. And they kind of recognizes the difference, and they let them have that difference. And so the Christians, they enjoyed that protection, being identified with the Jewish people for a long time, and that changed when the Jews started turning on them and saying, no, they actually don't belong to us at all. And so that seems to be the idea here, where it says that they are being slandered by those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. In other words, what's likely going on is that these Christians are being ousted by the Jewish people, by the Jewish synagogues that don't like them because of what they're preaching about Jesus and the gospel. And so as a consequence, once they're ousted by these Jews, they're being taken captive by the authorities and thrown in prison. Now, who would be responsible for that? That wouldn't be the Jews putting them in prison, although they end up there because of what the Jews are saying about them. But who ran all the prisons back then? So who are they suffering persecution at the hands of? It's from both sides, isn't it? They're getting it from the Jewish people, and they're getting it from the Roman government. And so everywhere they look, there's people that are out to get them at this point. It's very interesting, though, how Jesus words this. Who does he say is particularly responsible for the persecution and the imprisonment? It's Satan. It's the activity of the devil. He says it's the devil that's throwing you in prison. This is Satan's way of trying to get people to defect from Christianity, to get them to walk away from God and to give up the reward that they're going to enjoy if they just hang on. This last week in class, we were talking about, at some point persecution came up, and the teacher was making the statement, and he kind of threw it out there, that it seems like Satan's tactic in the first century was primarily persecution. That if you start believing in Jesus, it's going to physically cost you big time, whether that's a relationship with loved ones as they turn their back on you, or whether that is, being literally killed or in prison or fed to the lions. Seems like this is what Satan did for so long. And at least in our society now today, that's not really the case, right? Nobody in America is being put in prison for our beliefs. Maybe that'll happen one day, but it doesn't seem like we're really close to that point yet. Has Satan changed his tactics? Does he have a different tactic that he uses now? And if so, what does he use rather than persecution? Family? Okay. All right. Yeah, so get them while they're young, right? Yeah. I think there's a lot of truth to that. Go ahead. Ridicule? Yeah, all right. So just kind of verbal, yeah, insults. Steve?
I was thinking, to me, one of those tactics now is, every religion is fine, everything's fine. My judgment, it's whatever I want is fine, and God's okay with it. He's convinced a lot of religious people that they are in good shape, and they're a handful of counterfeit doctors.
Mm-hmm.
Satan always uses an element of truth in his lives.
Yeah.
There's still lies. I think he's got a lot of people convinced that are on the narrow path, and in reality they're on the wrong.
Yeah. Oh, good point. Other thoughts? Yeah, go ahead, Andy. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so the point the teacher made, he said, rather than using persecution, it seems like what Satan does now is he uses seduction, right? And is kind of very good at distracting us from what's important. And we kind of end up going through the motions, but when it comes to what our true master is, it's financial gain, or it's our career, or it's our family, or it's our comfort. And what's scary about that is that if we ever come to a point where we got to go through something like what Smyrna is going through, how prepared are we going to be for that? Not at all, right? And I kind of wonder if we've gone through this period where we've been very comfortable for a very long time, and now, if things get really hard, I just worry for the church what that would mean for people's faith. There's been papers that have been done on the connections between Daniel and Revelation. A lot of people believe that one of those connections is right here, where he talks about that they're going to be tested for 10 days. Well, that's kind of odd. It likely wasn't literally, okay, 10 days are up and now the testing's over. This is just communicating the temporary nature of the testing. But there was a section in Daniel where Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were tested for 10 days. So at what point in the book of Daniel were they tested for 10 days, and what was the test? Anybody got that one? A little piece of Bible trivia. Yeah, it was the first test, right? And of course, the reason that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they are going through this process where they're going to be able to serve the king, and they're kind of being assimilated into the culture, and it's going to take a few years before they're presented before Nebuchadnezzar. But part of that was, teaching them the wisdom, the language, and then in the process, they were feeding them the food from the king's table. And back then, to take the food from the king's table means that, man, you're just totally accepting this king into your life, right? That you're seeking that king's favor. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and likely because that food was associated with idolatry and it was unclean, they say, no, we're going to have no part of that. And they draw this hard line. They say, we're only going to eat vegetables. And one of Nebuchadnezzar's servants says, you can't do that. And Daniel says, well, give us 10 days. If we come out looking better than all the other young men, then you're going to let us do this. And so they go through 10 days, and they excel, and they stand out from among the crowd. But you look at the scenario there, you boil it down in Daniel, and it was very similar to what they were enduring here for Smyrna, which is probably why Jesus evokes that and causes that to come to mind for these Christians. He had Nebuchadnezzar, and what did Nebuchadnezzar think about himself in the Old Testament? What did he consider himself to be? He was a god, wasn't he? And he wants everybody to bow down to him, right? And of course, that's another test in that book that we read about. And part of that story in Daniel is them repeatedly saying no to these types of things where they'd be forced to compromise their faith. And so those four individuals in Daniel, they stand out in the Bible for Christians and still for Jews today as an example of those that are not going to compromise their faith no matter what. Doesn't matter if you offer them all that the king has to offer. Doesn't matter if you offer them the food that's on the king's table, that if it's something that causes them to compromise their loyalty and faith to God, they're not going to do it. And so this is the exact same situation that the Christians in Smyrna are in. They weren't necessarily being offered the food from the king's table, but they were being offered relief from suffering. They were being offered, favor from the local authorities. They were being offered and tempted with a much more comfortable life where they're not going to stand out and not going to be ridiculed and targeted for their beliefs. And yet they seem to not be buckling under that pressure. And so Jesus commends them for that even though they're suffering financially, they're suffering physically, they're still being faithful to God. And Jesus just simply encourages them to keep doing that. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life, is what Jesus says to them. And so this wasn't just talk, right? You see this throughout history, kind of the ramifications of what happened in Smyrna. Polycarp is an individual that we understand was a disciple of the Apostle John, so kind of interesting. And these things are not scripture, but I believe that they are helpful when we are looking at what the history of the church was outside the first century. And Polycarp was known as one of the elders of Smyrna. And so it's very likely that when John writes this letter, it might be the case that one of the people that read it, maybe read it to the congregation for all we know, was Polycarp. And oddly enough, Polycarp ends up being martyred, where? In Smyrna. And this is a record of that in the martyrdom of Polycarp, 9:2. This is the governor of Smyrna talking to Polycarp, and he says, "Swear by Caesar's fortune, change your mind, say, away with the atheists." It's interesting, Jesus' followers were known as atheists back then because they're rejecting all these gods. They didn't believe in gods, right? They believe in Jesus. And so he's saying and imploring Polycarp to say, away with the atheists, and just getting him to blaspheme Jesus. Another police chief to Polycarp, another police chief said this to Polycarp. He said, "What harm is it to say Caesar is Lord and to offer sacrifice?" In other words, why not just do it, and then you don't have to go through all this. You don't have to suffer and die. Just say Caesar is Lord, offer sacrifice, and be done with it. And this was finally Polycarp's response to these threats and to hearing these things. He said, "For 86 years I've served him, and he's wronged me in no way. How then can I revile my king who rescued me?" And so this was a very real thing that we see this, the fulfillment of this persecution probably happening in the days of Polycarp. And Polycarp is one of those people that ended up dying because of the types of things being mentioned and that Jesus warns them about in this letter written to Smyrna. And so I imagine maybe it was him that was getting encouragement, having received this letter, having been told, hey, you're going to go through these things. It's going to be temporary, but don't worry. It's interesting how Jesus introduces himself a little bit differently to each of these churches. The way that he introduces himself to Smyrna is he says, the words of the first and the last. Right? That's saying I'm sovereign. Right? I know what's happening at the beginning. I know how all this is going to end. Right? And so just be faithful to me, right? They're to get encouragement from who Jesus currently is, being in his exalted state, sitting at the right hand of God. But then he says this, not just the words of the first and last, and this is in verse 8, but he identifies himself as he who died and came to life, right? So even if you die, what can Jesus do? He can raise you from the dead, because that's the kind of Lord that we worship. We worship a Lord who died himself and came back to life. And so this was to give the people in Smyrna confidence, and perhaps we're seeing that confidence in this little quote from Polycarp as he was standing trial and eventually suffered martyrdom himself. Philadelphia, let's just quickly talk about Philadelphia with what little time we have. I don't have a lot of background information, but you do see that there's similarities between what Philadelphia was going through and what Smyrna was going through. As he mentioned, the synagogue of Satan with Smyrna, and Jesus mentions that to some of the other churches as well. He mentions that again with Philadelphia. He says at the end of verse 8, "You have kept my word and have not denied my name. Behold, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say that they are Jews and are not, but lie. Behold, I'll make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you." And so they seem to be suffering at the hands of the same types of people. And really this is what we've seen throughout Acts and what we've seen in Paul as he established these churches. The biggest opponents were always the Jews and the people in the synagogues. And so it's no different here with Philadelphia, with Smyrna, that they are suffering at the hands of the Jewish individuals that are likely ousting them to the Roman government and causing them to suffer in tremendous ways. So Philadelphia and Smyrna, there's nothing negative said about either of them. Again, they stand out. 2 out of 7, right? Jesus has nothing negative to say. That's not to say that they were perfect or that they didn't have flaws, but there's nothing that seemed to be jeopardizing their status before Jesus. What do you think it is about Smyrna, about Philadelphia, that allowed them to remain as faithful as they did? Their faith, obviously, right? Yeah. How are they different maybe than these other 7 churches of Asia? Of course, we haven't looked at all of them yet, but how are these two kind of different than the rest of the churches? What do Smyrna and Philadelphia seem to have in common? It's interesting to me that when you read about Smyrna, he notes their poverty. And here, what does he say about them at Philadelphia in verse 8? He says, "You have but little power." Some of these churches that are mentioned, Laodicea was known as being a very wealthy region. It seems like they had wealthy members. Sardis seems to be recognized as a church that had this reputation for being alive. They seem like the group that had it together, maybe in the eyes of people. And yet, when you look at Smyrna and when you look at Philadelphia, I think if you lined all these 7 churches up, if they all were located in Wichita, Kansas, I would figure that Smyrna and Philadelphia were probably towards the bottom of the churches that we would choose to go to, just because of how things appeared from the outside looking in. I mean, when we read Jesus' analysis, obviously that's the one that we would hopefully all say, that's the church I want to be a part of, because they were faithful. But if we didn't have these analysis that Jesus gives, and we're just observing these churches with the naked eye and judging them based off the fleshly standards that we normally use, Smyrna and Philadelphia, they wouldn't have been very attractive churches to join up with. And yet, they're the faithful ones. And maybe that had something to do with the fact that they had so little influence in the world, so little amount of money, so little material things to distract them from what was really important. You have Smyrna that is noted for their poverty, and you have Philadelphia that is noted for what little power they enjoyed. And some people think that might have had to do just with their influence, but probably had something to do with their numbers. It might indicate they weren't a very, very large congregation. Maybe it was just a handful of people. And we'd pass through that town, we say, man, that's a dead church right there. But Jesus looked down on it, and he noted how faithful that they were. Again, maybe it was because they just had nothing left but Jesus to depend on, but Jesus to look to. Maybe that's the reason they were so faithful. And all these other churches that had all these distractions, they were things that were pulling them away from Jesus. That's just one thought. Other ideas maybe as to why these two groups were faithful out of the 7.
Maybe the same idea, but my first thought when you asked the question was, it seemed to have a lot of the Lord. Right? It doesn't
They lost the reason they were doing all that. Yeah. Any other thoughts? So they both are kind of promised a reward, obviously. He says, don't fear. Again, I've already read this. Be faithful unto death. I will give you a crown of life, is what he says to Smyrna. Again, if you're the Jews or if you're the Roman government, every Christian that you put to death, you're thinking, there we go, we've gained some ground against these Christians, right? We've humiliated them. But what Jesus is saying is that that's when you get your reward. That's when you win, is when you die. That's when you get your crown, your victory crown of life. And similarly, he says to Philadelphia, I'm coming soon. Hold fast what you have so that no one may seize your crown. The one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. Never shall he go out of it, and I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down from my God out of heaven, and my own new name. And so just this language that is indicating you're always going to be in the presence of God. You're always going to belong to God if you just stay faithful. One interesting tidbit about Philadelphia that I think is worth sharing. One thing that happened historically with them was that in AD 17, there was a massive earthquake. Apparently this region, it was just known as being kind of this hotbed for earthquakes. It was also close to a volcano, so maybe that had something to do with it as well. And this particular earthquake just devastated the area of Philadelphia to the point where it destroyed this little city that they had. And because of that, the emperor at the time, the Roman emperor, he basically suspended the dues that were owed to him from Philadelphia. And he allowed all that money that they were saving to put it back into the city so that they could rebuild it quickly. So he suspended taxes, or from exacting taxes from them, for about 5 years. And because he did that, was pretty unusual. You can imagine the people in Philadelphia were extremely grateful. And they were so grateful, in fact, that they actually renamed themselves. They renamed the city. I don't know if they did this officially, but maybe it was kind of an informal thing. But they were known as, calling themselves Neo Caesarea, right? The new Caesar, basically, right? So they're naming themselves after the Caesar that did this kind thing. And in fact, there's even a possibility that later on they kind of changed their name informally again and referred to themselves as Flavia, which was the wife of the Emperor Domitian. And so they kind of changed their names twice because of their appreciation for this great deed that was done for them. Well, that grateful, warm feeling went away in, I think it was 93 AD, when Domitian, he makes this decree. In Philadelphia, they were known for their wine. They were renowned for the quality of the wine that they would produce. And they couldn't grow much, but they could grow vineyards. And they were known for having the best vineyards of the world. They were better than Italy when you look at it historically. And some people believe that it was because it rivaled Italy's wine that Domitian makes this decree. He says, you have to eliminate half your crops of vineyards, and you have to replace them with corn crops, which didn't do well in that area at all. And this devastated the people of Philadelphia because it devastated their economy, it devastated their livelihoods, and the city just kind of went downhill from there. And this decree happened around the time that this letter is being written. And so I say all that because I think it's a good illustration of where putting your hopes in a person, in a politician, will get you. Right? I mean, at one point, the politician is your savior. The next point, the politician is your enemy. And you find that really the only thing they were interested in all along was in themselves. And maybe that's why Jesus says that the one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. Never shall he go out, and I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem. So this is going to be your new name, not Neo Caesarea, not Flavia, but you're going to be known as the place where God dwells, essentially. And it's this contrast between how Jesus takes care of his people and how a human politician might take care of his people. And so when you go through this and you look at the characteristics of Smyrna and Philadelphia, they were persecuted, they were poor, at least Smyrna was. Philadelphia was insignificant. They were noted as having little power. And yet, what's the one positive thing about these two groups? What were they? They were faithful. What should that teach us as God's people? That, to me, should teach us a whole lot and be a really sobering reminder. What do you think that should teach us as God's people?
Material standards are the core nature of relationship with God.
Yeah, it teaches me that, number one, I got to be careful how I judge other congregations, that just because they don't live up to my fleshly standards, they might be very faithful in God's eyes. But I also have to remind myself to be careful how I judge my own congregation that I'm a part of, how we judge ourselves. And just because we look at certain things and we say, well, high attendance, that's a faithful congregation, or a congregation that gives this much money on a weekly basis or a monthly basis. Wow, that's really an indication of how faithful they are. Wow, look at this building. What a marvelous building they have. This is a very faithful congregation. All those things are worth ultimately nothing in God's eyes. And it's not to say that if we have a dilapidated building or if we have as little people as possible, then we're automatically faithful. It's not to say that either. But it is to say that those things are not accurate barometers or accurate tests of one's faithfulness. What it comes down to is just hanging on to Jesus, keeping with the way, recognizing and continuing to treat him as Lord of our lives, and refusing to compromise. So one thing we need to take away from this is that not all churches were the same. But there were those who were faithful in these 7 churches of Asia. There were those who weren't, and we'll begin to look at some of those that had flaws next week. Any other comments as we reflect on that? No? All right, thanks for your time. We'll pick up with Pergamum and Thyatira next week. Thanks.